All right. Hello again. This is our second lecture. So today we're going to be going over just some tips on sort of arguing and sort of what philosophy is about. There's going to be a lot of definitions today, so I'm going to warn you about that. This is a little weird too if you've never done a philosophy course. Just ways of thinking about sort of the point of what philosophy sort of is and what you do. It's not like a lot of other disciplines. So you may want to watch this again. I'll also post the PowerPoint, of course. I did have a handout, but I think the PowerPoint is honestly just goes into more detail. So I'm just going to post the PowerPoint. It is going to be very important that you sort of internalize and understand these definitions. So if anything's unclear, please reach out to me because if you guys sort of don't get this, it's going to impact your grade for the rest of the semester. So this is sort of a warning that this stuff will be on the exam or exams, probably both, and it will really impact your grade. So let's get started. So philosophy itself is a very abstract discipline. I sort of covered different areas last lecture. And so remember, it just deals with like fundamental issues, sort of with like things that concern humans. So morality for one thing, nature of the universe, stuff like that. It's very abstract. It's not history. It's not English. It's not psychology. And because it's so abstract, it requires careful argumentation. So this lecture is sort of just a crash course in how to argue in philosophy. I try to do this with my classes. I think it's extremely important because a lot of students struggle with this, or it's just weird if you've never done a philosophy course before. So like when I took my first philosophy class, I really wish this would have happened because I sort of picked stuff up as I was taking classes. I prefer to just sort of put it all out there at the beginning, just to sort of lay out, I guess, the expectations for what philosophy is. So like I said, again, there are a lot of definitions. Make sure you understand them. These definitely will be on the first exam. I may have some of them on the second exam too. It's going to be very important. These are very key concepts in philosophy. Okay. All right, so we're going to just start out with some sort of general definitions. I'm just going to sort of try to explain all of them and read off each one. Excuse me. So starting off in philosophy, statements or claims that have truth value or what we call propositions. So what a truth value is it's a statement that can be either true or false. It can't be both. So think about like positive and negative numbers. You can't have a number that is both positive and negative, unless like you say zero, but that's just the absence of any value. So these aren't going to be things like questions, commands, or expletives or proposals. They're going to be things that somebody says and you're like, okay, that's true, that's false. So for example, Joe Biden is the president of the United States. That claim has a truth value. It's true that Joe Biden is the president of the United States. Let's see. The sky is orange and made of cheese. That is also a proposition that's obviously false. The sky's not made of cheese. But these are both propositions. And the core of all arguments are propositions. Okay, so like I'm going to talk about premises here in a little bit. What happens in arguments is you have a few propositions that lead you to a conclusion, which is also a proposition. And if you're careful, the way arguing works in philosophy is you sort of build up. It's almost like a house of cards with propositions. That's sort of how I like to conceptualize it. Okay, moving on, we have what's an argument, and this is just defined as a chain of reasoning or a series of statements, propositions, namely, that are designed to prove something. Okay, And these statements themselves, these propositions, there are two kinds. There's what's called premises and then a conclusion. And what happens is you have a series of premises that are related to one another that justify a conclusion. And that's how arguing works in philosophy. That is what all philosophers do, is they make arguments. So these aren't the arguments you have with your little sister or your mom about staying out too late, or who ate the last scoop of ice cream. These are sort of proofs, and they're supposed to prove something. The idea is you have true statements that lead to a conclusion, which is also a true statement. That's the goal of philosophy. Okay. Moving on. So I briefly mentioned what are called premises, and these are just statements, propositions that support a conclusion. Okay. They should directly relate to the conclusion. So like superfluous information, what I call fluff. You may have heard that in other sort of classes centered on writing. These are superfluous information. Fluff is a big no-no in philosophy. It sort of detracts from the strength of your argument. If you have a bunch of stuff that doesn't really deal with your conclusion, it's going to be not a good argument. Okay. We're going to go through examples of different arguments, some really simple ones. But this is a big thing in philosophy, is make sure that your argument is sort of boring and sort of short. It should be not that long, usually. You shouldn't be like trying to add and do a bunch of fancy language and stuff like that in philosophy. That's not really what it's about. The goal of philosophy is to have very clear arguments that preserve truth. Okay. So moving on, some premises in inductive arguments are not clearly true. And I'm going to go over what are called deductive and inductive arguments here in a few minutes. But some premises themselves require premises to justify them. So like if you have a very complicated argument, what will happen is you'll have to do sort of mini arguments to get the premises that you want to do a major argument. And I'll be highlighting this throughout the semester. I try to break down, when we actually get into articles, I try to break down arguments into like premise, conclusion form, just to like try to make it very clear as to what's going on. So you'll see this with some more complicated arguments. But some arguments can have 20 premises. Some can have, 2. On that note, you do need at least 2 premises. You cannot, it is impossible to have a one premise argument and then a conclusion, because if you have a one premise argument, all you're establishing is that premise. You're going to have at least 2 premises. And from those, you sort of derive a conclusion from it. There's a lot of parallels to sort of mathematics in philosophy and arguing. And some instructors aren't very clear on that, but I think it's very important to know that philosophy is kind of at its core boring, and it should be boring. It should be almost mathematical. And I didn't put this in the slide, but if you have just a 2 premise argument with a conclusion, it's called a syllogism. And we'll go over. I have a lot of examples of some arguments. All right, moving on. Conclusion. This is whatever you're trying to prove with an argument. This is the point of an argument, is to convince your interlocutor. So that's a fancy philosophy word. That's just a person you're arguing with. The point of all arguments is to convince your interlocutor of this conclusion. Okay. Follows. So a conclusion follows from the premises when it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Okay, that's a little weird of a definition, but what it's basically saying is a conclusion, I'm trying to like rephrase it, but a conclusion will follow from the premises when the premises are true and the conclusion has to be true. So this is just a note on premises. Think of them also as assumptions. So I'll move into some examples when we go over validity and soundness, but basically in the premises, you assume they're correct, and then the conclusion follows. If sort of in the syntactic way that language works, the conclusion is going to be true if the premises are true. Okay. So moving on, there's two concepts, and these are, I will just go ahead and say these are for deductive arguments. I'm going to cover inductive here in a few slides. But an argument, a deductive argument, is going to be valid when the conclusion follows from the premises. So that's just assuming that the premises are true and the conclusion sort of follows directly from them. So it's like, if the premises are true, then this conclusion would be impossible for this conclusion to be false. That's going to be a valid argument. Okay. Soundness and a sound argument, it's going to be for deductive arguments as well. It's when an argument is valid and the premises are actually true. Okay, so that obviously requires sort of looking into the empirical world, and we'll go over some examples, but think of soundness as like validity plus the premises are actually true. And if the premises are actually true, then the conclusion will actually be true too. Okay, so let's move into some examples. Here's an example of a valid but not sound argument. So premise 1, all humans are panda bears. Premise 2, I'm a human. Conclusion, therefore I'm a panda bear. Okay. The conclusion follows from premises 1 and 2 because if we assume that all humans are panda bears and that I am a human, it's going to follow that I'm a panda bear. Okay. That's just the way that this sort of argumentation works. It's just the way this language flows logically. Okay, it's like if you have this category, all humans are panda bears, you can almost break it down into like a Venn diagram in your head. And you are a human, so you have this property. You're also going to have this other property, namely being a panda bear. Obviously, though, this is not a sound argument because all humans are not panda bears. It's valid, but it's not sound because it's just not true that humans are panda bears. We're two different species of mammal. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Please reach out to me if it doesn't. Like I said, this is going to be very, very important. If we were in person, I'd have a lot of other examples, and we'd go around the class and think of some more. But just remember, validity is the conclusion follows, and soundness is the conclusion follows, and the premises are actually true. Okay, so here's an example of a sound argument. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is like a very famous example, comes from Aristotle, who pretty much invented formal logic. This is a valid argument for one thing, because if we assume premise 1 and premise 2 are true, the conclusion will directly follow. Okay, it's actually in the same form as this last example with the panda bears. However, this is sound because the premises are themselves true. Okay, so all humans, all men, they are mortal. There's not been a case of some immortal person. That's just not true. Socrates is indeed a man. So Socrates is going to be mortal. That's sound because premise 1 and premise 2 are true. But to sort of see if an argument is sound, we have to look into what I call the empirical world. That's another sort of fancy philosophy term, but just the real world. Okay, you have to observe these things in the real world, and they are true. It's a very good example because all men are mortal. Socrates was a man, so Socrates is mortal. All right, I hope that makes sense. All right, so now those last two examples were deductive arguments. So I'm going to cover inductive arguments as well, because I do think it's important to understand the differences between them. So deductive arguments can be valid or sound because the conclusion is guaranteed to be true if the premises are true. Literally, moving back to our example, like I've said, if those premises are true, the conclusion is going to be true as well. That's just the way that deductive arguments work. They guarantee truth. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If your premises if your conclusion follows from your premises and your premises are actually true, your conclusion is going to be guaranteed to be true as well. That's just the way it works. Inductive arguments are different because if the premises are true with inductive arguments, you just have good reason to think the conclusion is true. Okay, so think about the difference is deductive arguments guarantee truth of the conclusion, whereas inductive arguments just give you sort of good reason to think it's true. Okay, it doesn't guarantee its truth though. It's just likely the case. And most arguments are inductive. Most ones that you encounter are themselves inductive. In moral philosophy, it's actually interesting because there are a lot of deductive arguments in moral philosophy, but a lot of arguments themselves are inductive by nature because they don't guarantee truth. Okay, so instead of being valid or invalid or sound or unsound, inductive arguments can be strong, cogent, weak, or uncogent. Okay, so a strong inductive argument is defined as if the premises are true, it is likely the case that the conclusion is true. The opposite, a weak inductive argument, is that if the premises are true, it is likely the case that the conclusion is false. So that's going to be a bad argument. That's a bad inductive argument. You don't want to do that. So sort of the parallel between soundness with deductive arguments and sort of the parallel with that is what's called being cogent. So an inductive argument is cogent if the premises are true and it's strong. Okay, so think about that like it's the equivalent of what soundness is for deductive arguments. Okay, an uncogent, an inductive argument is uncogent if one or more of the premises is false and or it's weak. You can also just say it's not cogent. These are just some definitions. We're going to go over some examples to try to really flesh this out. So take the following example. So premise one, the majority of college students are between the ages of 18 and 23. Okay, remember that's a proposition. It's true or false. It is true that is average. That is the average range of college students. Premise two, Catherine is a college student. The conclusion, therefore, Catherine is likely between the ages of 18 and 23. Okay. So you see how the conclusion just states that it is likely that Catherine is between the ages of 18 and 23. It doesn't guarantee it. This is an inductive argument. This is a cogent inductive argument. It's strong. And because, I mean, for one thing, let's say Catherine actually exists. It would be cogent if Catherine actually exists because the premises themselves are true, and it's strong because it is likely the case that Catherine is between the ages of 18 and 23. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to do another example. So this is a weak inductive argument. Premise one, pandas are classified as bears, missing the S there. Premise two, the diet of pandas mostly consists of bamboo. Therefore, most bears' diet consists of bamboo. This is actually a fallacy called the parts to whole fallacy. We're not going to go over that fallacy, but we are going to go over a few more at the end of this lecture. But you see how this argument posits, that's another fancy philosophy word. You see how this argument posits that most bears' diet consists of bamboo simply because pandas' diet consists of bamboo. That makes this argument weak because you're taking sort of this small sample size and you're trying to apply it to a larger group. Okay. And it's likely the case that most bears' diet does not consist of bamboo simply because pandas eat a lot of bamboo. Okay. So I hope that's clear. Like I said, please reach out to me. We would do more examples if this were a live class, but I you know, if you're struggling with this, please let me know. And we can go over some examples. Okay, so we've gone over two different kinds of arguments, deductive and inductive. Remember, deductive, it can be valid or invalid, and it can be sound or unsound because the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed by the premises. Okay, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false and the premises true if it's valid. Inductive arguments can be strong or weak, and cogent or uncogent or not cogent because the truth of the conclusion is not guaranteed by the premises. It's just likely the case. Okay. So now we're going to go over some fallacies that you should try to avoid in this class. That's a misspelt reasoning. I'm sorry about that. We're going to go over some fallacies. So I think fallacies are a very good way of sort of teaching critical thinking, and it's sort of informal logic. People tend to remember fallacies. So let's just go ahead and move on to them. So fallacy is just a mistaken reasoning. That's sort of the general definition. There's actually two kinds of fallacies, formal and informal. We're not going to worry about that too much because this isn't really a logic class. I'm just going to go over several that are extremely common, and I find a lot in students writing philosophy and also just in the real world. So if you watch the news or political pundits or debates or stuff like that, if you know fallacies, you can sort of call people out on them because they're not good to have in your arguments. Okay. So the first fallacy we're going to go over is what's called equivocation. I'm missing the S on happens, but equivocation, this happens when one word is used in more than one sense in an argument. Okay, so take the following example. Premise 1, taxes are a real headache. Premise 2, Tylenol makes headaches go away. Conclusion, therefore, Tylenol will make taxes go away. It's interesting because this is almost a valid argument. It appears to be a valid argument, but obviously it's ridiculous because the word headache is used in two ways. In one, it's referring to like a real headache, something that you can actually take Tylenol for. In the other sense, it just means it's a pain to do. You know, that's a real headache. It's a real headache to like get your car serviced. But they're the same word. So this happens a lot in philosophy. And in just arguments in general, people will use the same word, but they'll be defined as different things. Okay, and whenever that happens, you're committing the fallacy of equivocation. Okay, so that's the first one. Second, we have what's called appeal to authority, or it's also called appeal to unauthorized authority or something like that, or false authority. And this occurs when someone claims that a proposition is true simply and only because some authority says it's true. So there's nothing wrong with going to a good authority, especially on like complex issues. For instance, if I'm arguing about climate change and I refer to some scientific body or something like that, there's nothing wrong with that. It's sort of the way that you do it. Okay. So there needs to be good reasons why that person or institution or body of people is an authority. And it's these reasons that justify why a proposition that they would say is true. It's not simply because an authority like says something. So here's an example. Premise 1, my friend is a nurse. Premise 2, she says that vaccines cause autism. Conclusion, therefore, vaccines cause autism. This is an appeal to authority. This is a fallacy because you're just saying, well, my friend is, it's only in virtue of her being a nurse or him being a nurse. Well, she, yeah, I did use she. So it's only in virtue of my friend being a nurse why I'm justifying that vaccines cause autism. It's not the reasons underlying it. So if you were to say like, my friend is a nurse who's like researched a bunch and here's the data itself, you'd really be citing the data in an argument, not just my friend is a nurse and she says this. Okay, I hope that's clear. Like I said, please reach out to me if this is unclear at all, or you can also just Google any of these fallacies and find a lot of different examples. People like talking about fallacies a lot. All right, this is one of my favorite ones. Third, we have what's called an ad hominem. So that's Latin for against the man. This happens all the time. If you ever watch a presidential debate or any debate for a politician, you'll hear these. I remember when I was taking my first logic course, it was during the 2016 election, and for extra credit, we got to watch a debate and count the fallacies, and the amount of ad hominems was just, it was absurd. So this occurs when someone attempts to disprove a proposition by personally attacking the person or persons that hold it. So personal attacks and remarks about someone's life, their character, their views are entirely irrelevant to the truth value of the propositions that they say. So in philosophy, the way I conceptualize it is that arguments sort of exist in this theoretical vacuum. You cannot disprove what someone says by remarking on things that are beyond the scope of the argument. Okay, so take the following example. Let's just imagine we have two politicians debating. Premise one, my opponent as a college student belonged to the Communist Student Organization. Premise two, everyone knows that communism is an evil doctrine. That's also like a bad premise for other reasons. And therefore, if you vote for my opponent, you're supporting communism and detrimental public policies. Okay, this is like a personal attack, basically. They're trying to, the person giving this argument is doing a personal attack on their opponent that has nothing to do with what they're saying. So let's, I remember the primaries in 2016, there was talk about in like sort of the Hillary Clinton camp about being open that, or accusing Bernie Sanders of being an atheist. This happened also in the civil rights movement with like Bayard Rustin, who was part of the Communist Party and was an atheist. You sort of have these personal attacks that are meant to discredit somebody's views and arguments. And that's a fallacy. What somebody identifies as, their character, their education status has no bearing whatsoever, sort of in this theoretical vacuum on what they say. Okay, so in arguing, you have to sort of take the premises and the conclusion and the argument itself sort of as separate from somebody's life. But that's sort of the abstract nature of philosophy. That's why it requires careful argumentation, is because it doesn't matter if somebody's a communist or a libertarian or whatever. It has no bearing whatsoever on their argument. Their argument's either good or bad on its own grounds. It does not matter whatsoever about any details about their life. Basically, it has no bearing on what they say whatsoever. Okay, and that's a little weird, but I'll try to repeat that throughout the semester. Okay, so next we have what's called begging the question, and this is when the conclusion is assumed in the premises. So this is actually a pet peeve of mine. If you've ever heard somebody say, well, this begs the question, and then they mean like, well, this raises the question. That's sort of like the colloquial usage. Somebody on TikTok was doing it a few weeks ago and like gave me a headache. So this actually refers to a fallacy, and it's a formal fallacy because it actually deals with like the form of an argument. Don't worry about that too much. But this is not, this does not mean, oh, this raises the question or this leads me to, my next question. That is not what this means. Okay. It literally just means the conclusion is assumed in the premises. So I have two examples. It's hard to break these down into sort of premise conclusion form because they're weak arguments. But let's take the following example. Apple makes the best smartphones in the world because no other company can make smartphones as well as Apple does. This is an instance of begging the question because the speaker is assuming the claim is true and is only backing it up with another claim that's similar, and it's not really providing any evidence. So it's very similar to the next fallacy that we're going to go over, which is circular reasoning, but they are a little different. Students do sort of get confused by them. So often begging the question can be a form of circular reasoning, but it's sort of a special form. And this is just when the conclusion is assumed in the premises. Please look up some more examples if this one isn't sort of making it clear to you, or reach out to me, we can go over it. It's hard to break it down into premise conclusion form or like syllogistic form, mainly because you would have the conclusion in a premise and then the conclusion. So look up other examples or reach out to me, please, for more if this isn't clear. All right, next we have what's called circular reasoning. And this occurs when evidence for one proposition is used as evidence for another proposition and vice versa. So let's say we have proposition A. Proposition A would be evidence for B and B as evidence for A. Okay, and it sort of makes a theoretical circle if you think about it. I wish I had a whiteboard so I could sort of draw it up, because you can literally draw two propositions up for like circular reasoning and draw arrows, and it just goes in a circle. Sort of you can highlight how it goes. Goes in a circle. To take the following example, I know that God exists because the Bible says so, and I know the Bible is true because it is the Word of God. What's happening is these two propositions are backing one another up. So I again, I wish I had a whiteboard. Sort of the way that premise, conclusion arguments work is there's sort of a downflow. You sort of start with premises and it's like a downward arrow. It only moves in like one direction. It's like premise one, premise two will justify premise three and premise four justify the conclusion. It's sort of like an arrow pointing down. Like that's like the sort of theoretical flow of a good argument. Whereas this just has sort of two propositions that back each other up. And that's bad. That is not good reasoning. It's not a good argument. Okay. We can go over some more examples. Like I said, please reach out to me, or just you can Google these and you'll find plenty of examples. All right, next we have what's called a bandwagon argument. This fallacy occurs when someone claims that a proposition is true simply because it's widely accepted. This is also pretty prevalent in political discourse, especially. Take the following example. Most people believe in God, therefore God exists. It's just because the majority of people hold a proposition to be true does not mean that the proposition is actually true. Okay, so remember, like, arguments are sort of in a theoretical vacuum. It does not matter unless like a premise itself sort of makes a claim about the world. Then you can look into the world and see if it's true or not, if you're seeing if it's sound or cogent. But it doesn't matter what most people think in sort of philosophy land. This is abstract, and it's sort of it's a different theoretical space than real life. Basically, it's like Neverland, but philosophy land. That's the way I sort of think about it. And just know it doesn't matter. Like, let's say you have another sort of political example. Let's say you have somebody running for president that's like, well, the majority of Americans are Christian, and this is a Christian nation, and that's a bandwagon argument, okay? Because they're sort of justifying a proposition on grounds that most people think this, and that's a fallacy. It's illogical to do that, okay? Because it doesn't matter what most people think. The proposition is either true or false, and it's sort of true or false on its own terms. Okay. Moving on, false dilemma. This is another very prevalent fallacy, especially in politics. You do see a lot of fallacies in political debates because they're not careful. They're sort of sensational arguing instead of like actually carefully examining an issue. So a false dilemma is when someone forces you to choose between an arbitrarily limited number of options. Oh, sorry. My throat's dry. So take the following example. You can do one of two things. Let's say, somebody's, arguing this. It's like, you can do one of two things. You can support this war or be a traitor to this country. So obviously there's more options than that. Let's say you're an anti-war person. Obviously, just because you don't support a war that your country is going to do doesn't mean you're a traitor. That's just not true. You can be anti-war but still love your country. That there's nothing wrong with that. But what's happening here is you have somebody saying, well, you have option A or you have option B. And usually they do this sort of maliciously to say, well, option B obviously you don't want, so you have to go with me on option A. But anytime there are like other options, but the speaker tries to convince you that like there's two or a few, usually it's two, this fallacy has occurred, and it's illogical. It doesn't work. Okay. Moving on. Straw man. This is another extremely prevalent, I'm not going to say popular fallacy, because this one happens by accident a lot. This fallacy occurs when someone misrepresents someone else's argument as weaker than it actually is. So it gets its name because it's like you build up a straw man and then you like knock over a straw man. It's really easy to like knock over sort of an effigy that's made of straw. It's harder to knock down a real person. That's sort of where it gets its name from. So take the following examples. Let's say, again, we have some politicians arguing. My opponent is an advocate for people to be able to choose to get an abortion, so they support people's right to kill babies. This is a straw man because they're misrepresenting somebody else's argument. Let's say somebody's giving like a decent pro-choice argument. that deals with women's right to choose or something like that. This is a straw man because it's misrepresenting somebody's actual position. And obviously, if somebody held this position, it would be extremely weak because it's ridiculous. Another example, you said you support people being able to own firearms, therefore you support school shootings. This is just another good, clear example of a straw man, because obviously, I mean, if you have a decent argument, in favor of people owning firearms, it's not going to include the right to, commit a school shooting. That's absurd. So anytime you sort of have this sort of move, it's going to be a straw man. Appeal to tradition. This one happens a lot as well. Try to avoid it, especially if we talk about things like euthanasia, which we will in your own arguments. This one happens a lot. I see it a lot with students. This fallacy occurs when someone tries to argue that something is correct simply because it's always been done this way. So take the following examples. Let's say we have somebody saying gay marriage is wrong because we've never allowed it in this country. Socialism is wrong because America has never been socialist. These are fallacies because just because something has been done one way throughout history does not mean that that is the correct way of doing things. Or just because a proposition has been traditionally held doesn't mean that that proposition is actually true. So think about, I hate to, I don't want to like attack anybody, but sort of with the Big Bang Theory, there's good reason to think that there's a scientific explanation for the way the universe is. But think about somebody arguing, well, it's not a theistic picture of the world, and we've always been theists. People have always believed, Genesis, therefore it's wrong. That's just another sort of example of this. You can't just appeal to the way things have been done or the status quo as being correct simply because it's the status quo. Okay. Please look up, like I said, more definitions, or I mean more examples, or reach out to me if this stuff isn't clear. All right, I think this is the last one we're going to be going over. This is called missing the point. This fallacy occurs when the premises of an argument have nothing to do with the conclusion, or you overlook and or fail to understand an essential part of the argument. Okay, this happens a lot accidentally, and all these fallacies can happen accidentally. They don't have to be intentional. But they are flaws in reasoning, so they are sort of bad. So let's take the following example. Let's say two politicians are arguing about universal health care. Oh, I'm sorry. I had a different example. So let's say they're arguing about like a rise in crime. Sorry about that. So we have crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing steadily in the area. Therefore, we should bring back the death penalty. That's obviously missing. This person would be assuming that because the death penalty is not around, that people are robbing places more because they're not afraid of the law or something like that. Obviously, there's, well, I don't know if it's obvious, but there are better explanations for why theft and robbery may be increasing in area, and it probably has nothing to do with the death penalty being there or not. It's sort of missing the point of what the issue is. Okay. This one's a little more vague, so I would say look up some more examples on your own, or like I said, reach out to me and we can talk about it. Okay, so this is the last slide. I'm going to talk about just sort of the quiz. We're going to be doing a quiz just like we did with the syllabus. But here's just 3 sort of general tips that I'll say throughout the class. I'll repeat these as much as I can. But when we actually move into the when we actually move into the articles that we read, make sure that you understand the arguments that are made in the article and your own when you give your own arguments. So for instance, make sure that your conclusion has to do with your premises and that it follows from them. That's going to be very important. You should definitely know what you're arguing. Okay, it should be very clear. I have students all the time on the essay portion of their exams and papers they turn in. They'll have this really opaque and vague argument with a lot of like philosophy buzzwords, and I can see right through that. if you don't have a clear idea of what you're arguing and why you're arguing it and why your conclusion is justified by your premises, I'll be able to tell. It's very easy to tell if students like understand what they're arguing or not. Also, I mean, just understanding the arguments that we go over by philosophers, that's going to be very key. Because if you, for instance, when we discuss abortion, if you misrepresent, we're going to read an article by Thompson. If you misrepresent her argument or you misunderstand it, and then you give a counter argument to that, your counter argument's not going to work because you're attacking an argument that doesn't exist. Okay, so it's going to be very, very, very important to understand these arguments that we're going to be going over. Okay. Step 2, don't believe an argument just because you agree with it. So just because the conclusion is true doesn't mean that the argument itself is a good one. Okay, so we're going to be going over abortion, euthanasia, gun rights. I'm certain that the articles we'll read, you will either sort of vaguely agree with one or the other. I try to like pick ones that are sort of on opposite ends. They, one says abortion is permissible, one says it's not permissible. Just because you're pro-choice or pro-life doesn't mean that either one of those arguments is necessarily good. Okay, you can agree with the conclusion of an argument and still think it's a bad argument. That happens all the time in philosophy. I mean, that's a big bulk of what professional philosophy is sort of refining these positions to make it better. So there are like pro-choice critiques of the Thompson article we're going to be reading. There's libertarian critiques of gun rights articles we'll be reading. That people that actually, are on that side of the issue, like calling the argument bad because it, sometimes it is a bad argument, even if you agree with it. Okay, so that's just to say, don't believe an argument just because you agree with it, or namely the conclusion of that argument. 3, avoid fallacies as much as possible. Usually you can do this by understanding the issues at hand and making sure your own arguments are sound or cogent. And you'll pick up more and more sort of, it's very intuitive the way sort of like logically arguing works. Obviously, like I'm not expecting you guys to be able to give, crazy knockdown arguments, but the more that we read arguments and the more that we sort of go over and refine and break down arguments, the more you'll be able to see sort of how things logically flow from one thing to another. Okay. It's just a skill that you pick up in philosophy when you do it a lot. And that's why philosophy is very good, because it's a very careful discipline. And it's very key to understand the arguments that are being made and your own arguments. Okay. So I'm going to have another quiz posted. I'm also sorry that this is a bit late. I had some computer issues. I'm not a fan of online teaching. I prefer in person. So hopefully we do go back in about a week and a half. I would love to go back in person. So let's hope CBU does that and Omicron sort of doesn't get any worse than it is. I will have another quiz posted. So it's going to be due, I'm going to make it due on Sunday, just because I did post this a little late. But keep in mind, like those quizzes, it's just for attendance and participation, and mainly because I have to report it to Bannerweb. So please make sure you do it. The earlier you do it, the better. If everybody does it before Sunday, I can fill it out quicker. But I will make the deadline. It'll be 5 o'clock on Sunday. But I'll also post when I post this link. I'll put a reminder. So yeah, please reach out to me if you're having any issues understanding any of this stuff. I'm paid to help you guys understand this. It's going to be very important that you guys understand this stuff, especially those definitions. Like I ask on so many exams, difference between soundness and validity, and cogent and not cogent. These are very, very, very important concepts. And please reach out to me if anything's not clear, or if you need sort of more examples for fallacies. You can Google any of these and they'll come up with a lot of, there's videos on YouTube on them, and there's also just countless examples on the internet. So have a good weekend. I will be posting another lecture for Tuesday. I'm going to try to get it done on Monday. I'm sorry, I've been behind. But have a good weekend. Stay safe, and please reach out to me if you need anything. Thank you.